Hey, everybody, you're listening to and watching the Comic Book Bears podcast. I'm Bill Zanowitz.
And I'm Steve Mowry.
And we are your hairy, heavy helmets that talk about comic books, but you don't have to be a hairy, heavy helmet to listen in, or in this case, stream in. And Steve, I think it's been over a year since it's just been the two of us.
I think that's right. I think we've only... Yeah, I think every time that we've been broadcasting since, at least with the video, it's been at least three of us, sometimes four.
Yeah. So. Yeah. No, it's been, and I think actually the last time we did a show that was just the two of us was just before the lockdown, when we provided either we did the free shows like just as it was, the free books just as it was happening. Or I have to take a look. That was a good show. I really enjoyed that one.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, but this one's going to be fun. This one's going to be fun. I swear this one's going to be fun.
It'll be loose. It'll be fun. Maybe you'll learn something, or maybe you'll get some reference material for that thesis you're writing.
Dumping the knowledge on you on this one, really, folks. Dumping the knowledge on you. We, in other words, myself, wasn't able to read that many comic books. New ones. So we decided for this episode, we were going to talk about books about comics. And I've got a stack, and Steve's got a few. And it's going to range from things like price guides to books about comic book history, comic book eras, comic book franchises. Got a whole bunch of things planned for what the discussion points will be. Steve, before we get moving, I've not been able to figure out what your hoodie is there. So can you just show what that is?
So this is a reference to those of you who are video game nerds. About 10 years ago now, there's this little game that came out, wasn't very well known, called Elder Scrolls V Skyrim. And one of the big gags was the guards tend to talk about how they used to be all adventurous, but then they took an arrow to the knee, and now they just kind of wander around and make your life annoying. But yeah, it's just a favorite of mine, and I love this. And it also glows in the dark, which is pretty neat. I'm not going to do that now because then we wouldn't be able to see me. But no, just a fun, goofy hoodie that I enjoy,
and
that nobody gets unless they've played the game.
And as for me, I'm in a polo shirt for a change.
So it'd be really funny if you had instead of like a little polo guy, like maybe it was I don't know, Marvin the Martian or something.
No. I do have a polo. It doesn't fit me anymore, but it's Muttley from Dastardly and Muttley. Yeah, when I still have it because I just can't give it up, and I'm thinking like, someday I'll cut the Muttley out and put it on. When Warner Brothers shops were closing, you got amazing deals. A friend of mine got those beautiful Alex Ross plates. Do you remember those?
Oh, okay, yeah.
He got one for $20, and those were like, I want to say they were like the list price was like $298 or something. It was something like ridiculously high.
Yeah,
and Muttley was one of those purchases. But with today, as I was explaining, Steve, before we started, I had a Zoom call, and it was a video Zoom call, and there was somebody high up enough that we decided, hey, let's not wear t-shirts like we usually do, and be a little more dressed up. And we get on the Zoom call, and said higher up is in a Philadelphia Phillies t-shirt. So that's how things go.
It works. It's all good. Corporate world is very strange now.
Yeah, it's a very weird terrain that we're on right
I think
now.
I think it's just generally hard to be formal when you're clearly sitting in your in your wife's like unused craft room in a corner, with possibly kids or pets that are just kind of in the background.
This is where I am when I make the magic happen. You're in the same boat, right? This is where you work.
Yeah, this is where I work as well as read. Although I sometimes also read in my bedroom too, just to, because it's a big bed and it's comfy. I mean, why not stretch out? But yeah, as you can see, like most of my reading material ends up here. So I swear I can find things. I swear. Most things I can find. Most things.
All right. Well, this is going to be an interesting episode because we also come from different age points. If you can't tell, how much older am I from you, Steve? 14 years?
2 or 3 years, something like that. It's really.
No, it's more than that. All than that.
I don't know. I think it's. I think I'm about like 13, 14 years older than you are. Yeah.
I think it's around that. Well, great. Well, let's not even get into that. Oh, and also we are tabling discussion about the Snyder Cut. One of us has watched it. One of us hasn't. I had to do it in 3 shifts. I did it before I logged off for work, a little bit at lunch, and then after I logged off. But I got all 4 hours in there. A lot I want to talk about, but I'll wait. And of course, tomorrow we have Falcon and Winter Soldier. I'm sorry, like I had a teacher that instead of saying Falcon, always said Falcon.
Falcon.
And which is actually the correct pronunciation. And I have carried that with me my entire life.
Yeah, I mean, I usually just go with whatever group I'm talking to, because Falcon or Falcon is not really something that I say on a daily basis in general. But we will all be saying it every Friday and Saturday from now on, for at least for the next 6 weeks, because of the new show dropping tomorrow on Disney Plus, Falcon and Winter Soldier. Yeah. So we've got James Figueredo has joined us tonight.
Cool.
Eating him some nerds, and he also says it's not messy, it's particularly organized. Yes, right. For your citations, people, for your citations when you're writing your paper.
It's free form.
Free form. I know where it is. But yeah. I mean, the Snyder Cut of, or the director's cut, for lack of a better term, I'll be watching this weekend.
What you would, if the official title is Zack Snyder's Justice League. That's the official title.
It's what he would have made had he been able to see it to completion, which he wasn't, for very personal reasons. He wasn't able to, and also what ended up in movie theaters was definitely not the direction that he was going through or going for. But again, because as a director's cut, you can pretty much put whatever else you want, whatever would have normally ended up on the cutting room floor, because executives and focus groups would say, no, this is either too long or too much, or we don't need to get into this, or I don't really get that part. And so not only did he keep the story the way he wanted it to go, but he also added in a bunch of extra stuff that he probably would have had to cut anyway, just to get into mainstream cinemas, which is why you have a 4-hour and 2-minute long special director's cut edition. But I'll get to experience that this weekend.
There was one thing from the Joss Whedon helmed theatrical cut that I liked better. And we got to talk about it. I'm dying to talk about this. I really am.
Next time.
Yeah.
Jazz hands.
Okay, so we're going to start this off with the first book that each of us ever had in our hands, that we ever owned, about comics. Now, as again, you're seeing this gray. I'm old as sand, and you can see the condition of this book. It's pretty ragged here. I imagine this tape is from the 80s, but this is a 1965 book. But I got it when I was 6 years old, and it is the classic book, The Great Comic Book Heroes by Jules Pfeiffer. Jules Pfeiffer, of course, has renown as a cartoonist and as a playwright. And it really was the first serious book about comic books, particularly comic book superheroes. There were some about comic strips that predate it, but this was the first, again, hardcover, serious publisher entry into that area. And it's actually half text, you'll see. And I specifically remember, because I got this when I was 6 years old, and I particularly remember asking my mother what diabolical meant and what backbone meant. There were certain words that I couldn't remember. And also there's a description about Robin as a fag. And she was like, I don't even remember what she said, but, it was 1965. And it was also, from the context of a child. So don't slam Jules Pfeiffer. He's one of my heroes. And again, this, focused on the Golden Age heroes. And for a long time, that was what you got with comic books. You had very few out there up until the late 70s. You had the Steranko history of comic books. He's a problematic figure now. Dude, never slam China when you got a toupee like that on your head. There was another very famous book, mostly in paperback, but there are some hardback editions, called All in Color for a Dime. And that was written by Dick Lupoff, and there were other guest writers and guest chapters. But again, a big focus on the Golden Age. And it also makes perfect sense because a lot of those authors and a lot of the creators from the 70s, like Paul Levitz and Michael Uslan and Paul Kupperberg, who's been on our show, they all came out of fanzines. And, particularly with fanzines, there was this, glow about the Golden Age because these books were very hard to find then. There wasn't a collector's market, and that was just coalescing at the time. So for the first few years, you had just, basically an attention span on the Golden Age, maybe a paragraph or two about what was happening in the Silver. Almost always involved the Batman TV series. There was always a reference in those books on that. But that led to price guides. And this is my very first Overstreet comic book price guide. This is the 77 to 78 edition. And wow. I got this one, and then I didn't get the next one. Because this was like $7.95, and that was a lot of money then, especially
that is a lot
a
in
kid,
the 70s.
Yeah. And I got 7, and then I got 9, which concentrated on the EC books, and we'll talk about the EC horror books a little bit later. But this blew my mind. Comic books and price guides. Pre-internet, this was a Bible practically. So Steve, I just want to go through something. Why don't you name like 3 books that would have been published before 77, and I'll tell you what the guide price is in here. This might be fun.
Sure. How about Sergeant Fury and his Howling Commandos #1?
Sergeant Fury and his Howling Commandos #1. I wish you didn't do that because I never know whether they go to SE or SG.
I think it might be under SG because it was like SGT. I think it was shortened.
Sergeant Fury, to get a mint copy, was $30.
Which again, you could have bought 4 price guides for the cost of 1 Sergeant Fury. That's pretty good. But then again, that was what, 1968? I think. What was the year in Sergeant Fury? 64 maybe?
64.
64?
63 or 60. Yeah.
So really, in terms of like when that price guide was out, it's right there.
It was it covered. It was May 1963.
1963. So really, by the time that was published, it was only 13 years old, which isn't a lot. Like, I mean,
that's amazing.
If you think about like the books from the 60s, the Marvel books that were like the really huge ones now that we think are huge ones now. I mean, they were only a decade, maybe 2 decades old before they probably hit like the really, really crazy high prices. I'm sure that you had like Amazing Fantasy #15 in there is probably not cheap.
Let's see.
First appearance, Spidey Man.
Amazing Fantasy #15.
Hi, Brad Taylor.
$225.
$225, which is pretty spectacular for a comic book.
Yeah.
In 1976.
This is the one that just knocks me out, though, because I seem to remember that there was momentum about X-Men by the time this came out, but giant size X-Men, $1.
$1. What was cover price on that?
You're talking, 3 years after it was published, but $1 for a mint copy. I guess that makes sense because it would have been in the early 100s and Byrne hadn't come on, and that's I don't know. So
Claremont and all that.
Yeah, so the guides were, so important to have this on hand. And, then you go years later and you find that there's errors, there's books that don't exist. But these were super important. I think my last price guide was probably like 2,000. I've only gotten like 5 or 6 over time. But very, very early book. With the earliest book. So, Steve, let's see your earliest book, because I have a feeling we're going back to this because of that one.
Yeah. Well, hello, we just had 2 new people join us. Brad
cool.
Taylor, hello. And then also
Brad.
Brian Pittard. We might know Brian from somewhere. Brian sounds familiar. Wish he could join us
Vaguely.
tonight. I know he's crazy busy.
Vaguely.
But yeah, so you talked about your first book. Again, I was... we're a couple years apart. And so when I started really looking at comic books, really buying comic books and when to get into it, it was, 1990. So I didn't really have a lot of references. There was no real internet there. I think we had Prodigy maybe, but, I'm not hanging around on BBSs asking everybody who comes in, like, can you tell me about the history of comics? So what I did was I went to the... B. Dalton Booksellers. I got myself something called The Collector's Guide to Comic Books. And this is by John Hegenberger. It even still has the price tag on it, so I can tell you exactly how much I paid for it. Was $11.66 plus tax. So that was my book. But the great thing about this, and I think very similar to, to the book that you had, is that it does mix the prose quite a bit with a lot of reproduced covers. So you get a whole bunch of really great images here. And this was a wonderful way for me to actually look and see at what all of these Golden Age and Silver Age comics look like. Mm-hmm. And I'm trying to think, they actually did have some color, some great color plates as well. So you got to, see some of these things. The interesting thing about this is that, obviously it's for a guide for people who are collecting comics. So this is right on the cusp of the massive speculator boom that had been, obviously percolating through the 80s. But then once the 90s hit, man, that was where it went really crazy. And this is basically right about that time that it's coming out. So a lot of what they're talking about is how to grade your comics, what to look for, what's the best way to get a good deal. If you're at a comic book convention, buy comics from one dealer and then sell them to another so you can get that other comic that you wanted to get. Just all sorts of craziness. But it goes into depth about sort of how to find out about comics. It talks about, who the big artists and authors, the big artists and the big writers are. All men, unfortunately. According to John Hegenberger, it's basically the ones that he really was interested in. But it's a great primer. It gives you sort of like a place to jump off of. It tells you what to look for, what kind of books are really interesting, what eras are interesting, what kind of things to look out for. And also gives you these great, these great images. Tells you, like, hey, look for this particular comic because it's the first appearance of so-and-so. It talks about comic book conventions, what to do there, and actually still has a piece of advice that I use to this day, which is don't blow all your money with the dealers. Save some money for food and for, transportation, because you got to get your ass home at some point. And you don't want to be broke trying to sell off some of the comics that you just bought, which, by 2000 something probably is not going to happen with you walking around a comic convention saying, please pay me for this. But it's really fantastic.
That's really
and
interesting.
I loved it because, other than, the focus and the attention paid towards people who are purchasing comics as an investment, there's a lot in here that shows that Hegenberger and kind of like how he grew up, his history with comics are based on the fact that he loves them. Because unlike probably a lot of other speculator guides and comic buying guides, he talks about reading them when you get them home. Like, find that really expensive, that thing that you've been digging for. And then when you get home and read it and carefully turn the pages, and I'm like, whoa, man, hold on. I thought you were collecting these for investment reasons. So you're going to be immediately putting these away in some kind of like, lucite cave. But no, and he even talks about bagging and boarding and taking care, with tape and everything. But comics are to be read, and this is actually something that he brings up all the time. It's like collecting comics is great, but why just collect them just to have them? Get them so you can read them, which is, now obviously if you're a speculator for anything, it's like, why would I want to do that? But this was great, and this kind of gave me something to look at, because I didn't have the internet to go and just look things up. I didn't have Wikipedia to go and pull up, or an image search to go and find covers or things like that. I could actually just go ahead and flip through this book and see a whole bunch of stuff like Lady Blackhawk's wedding, that issue. It's there. It's in here. There are some things that do give me pause and realize that it is from 1990. And I think I showed you, there's an image from an issue of All-Star Squadron that had, I believe it was Amazing Man. And the little caption down at the bottom was, "Black superheroes really haven't found a foothold in today's fandom." It was just sort of like, oh, well, maybe in 1990, I guess there weren't many. Yeah, there weren't many superheroes of color. There weren't many.
There wasn't anyone carrying a title at that time. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And obviously that's a very different world now. And so, this is 30 years old, and in 30 years, and again, that's the other thing too. He's talking about, you could still find 1960s and 1970s comics, Silver Age comics, relatively cheap because it's 1990. So it was only 30 years prior that we're talking about.
Yeah, I have to say, though, as somebody who was like on the lookout for stuff, 89, 90 was kind of when it changed. When the Silver Age stuff, if you like dug the ads, you could always find cheap issues of Jimmy Olsen or Challengers of the Unknown if you were just like looking for ads, because some people did that. They used to buy the books just for for ads. And 89, 90 was when it kind of started changing a little bit. Steve, you there? I lost you, Steve. Well, I'm not sure if I should riff or not. I'm hoping Steve comes back. I'm hoping this isn't me.
There we go.
Oh, there he is. Okay.
Yeah, it's not you. It's just me.
Oh, I did not like that.
I hit the wrong button. But I'm good. I'm glad it kept going.
Yeah.
What you were saying there, I mean, these are, it's really interesting what was happening about that time. And I think when I started reading it, like, this probably was written in maybe 89 and published in 90. And so when I'm reading it, that's where things are really starting to go crazy. Brian actually has a couple notes here that are really interesting here. So most of his price guides came from
Wizard.
Issues Wizard. Same here, because I had my Wizard subscription, and you would flip through the back and there would be like a list of all the hot comics with the price guide. You also had totally would have expected you cruising the boards. Yeah, maybe not at 9-10 years old. This is also before those AOL chat rooms, so yeah, that wasn't a thing. So you want to cruise Artist Alley. One of the interesting things about this, Brian, to kind of talk about this, what not to ask at a panel, in this guide, there is a whole section in the comic book conventions, and he does talk about the fact that he never went to panels. He's like, yeah, look at all these greats, from DC and whatever, talking about this, that, or the other thing. Like, yeah, but where I really want to spend all my time is right in the pit, right with the vendors, and then over to the artists to get signatures, and that's where I want to spend all my time. Which is unfortunate because, nowadays, the best thing to do is to go to the panels. Yeah, nowadays nothing. But like 2019 and earlier,
Yeah. Actually, Chris Cummins and I are planning to go to a comic book convention, small one in Philly, next month.
Oh, that'll be great.
No guests, it's just vendors. It's nothing like a big convention, just a small one. But it's going to be nice to just feel, like a taste of that atmosphere again. My biggest,
obviously with lots of COVID precautions.
My biggest COVID problem. My biggest convention faux pas was I was about to leave Wizard World Philly, and I stopped at this vendor, and you know how sometimes like on Saturdays, not Saturdays, on Sundays they mark prices down so they don't have to carry as much back if it's back issues. And this guy was putting stuff up, and I got like almost a full run of the Ostrander written Spectre series and a bunch of other things for like 10 cents each. And they were also bagged and boarded. My back hurt so bad with that extra bags that I was carrying that by the time I got to the car, which was like maybe like a 3-block walk, I was done. I mean, it was so bad. So pace yourself in terms of when you're getting stuff. Good thing is have a friend who has a table. That's nirvana.
Oh yeah.
To me, that's.
Can you hold my bags back here for a while? Sure.
Yeah, you don't mind, do you? Yeah. Oh, of course. Yeah, and then maybe get a pity print or something.
Oh yeah. Well, and that is one of those little notes that he does talk about. Wait until don't buy as soon as you get there. Go multiple days, and so if you go on a Sunday, they usually mark it down. And this is like really great because his focus is on buying. Buy those things. Oh,
and that's interesting. 30 years on, this is still valid.
Exactly.
Valid advice. Yeah.
Although he does have something that made me immediately think of you when I was rereading through this, flipping through some of these guys. He says, "Always bring your list," and I'm like, I've seen that list. I have seen the list, the Zanowitz list.
Bill's list, which is not so much a want list as an I don't have list.
Yes.
Because there are books that I would buy for a dime and books that I would buy for 50 cents.
Mm-hmm.
And that if they were 50 cents, I wouldn't buy. That's. I always bring up Lobo. Okay, Lobo's always my example. I'm such a DC fan. If I find Lobo for 10 cents, I'm gonna gobble it up. If it's $1, forget it.
Where you're finding stuff for 10 cents nowadays? Oof.
Yeah, and it's so funny because out of us, I'm the only back issue guy. I think Caleb is a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But Brian's digital, your trades mostly at this point, at least in terms of conventions, correct? Yeah.
Oh yeah, all trades.
We'll come from different places. And also mentioning Caleb, he's certainly the more original art dude out of the four of us. So. But that's interesting. I would like to track a copy of that down. I think I have. Who's the publisher on that? Because I think I have a book on toys that is.
So this is from Wallace Homestead. They're out of Pennsylvania. I don't know. I haven't seen anything else.
I may have a toy book somewhere in there. Oh no, what it is? It's film posters and lobby cards. Mm-hmm. That's the book I have from the same publisher. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Enough of distractions there. Keeping going. And my next recommendation is problematic. And I'll go into it why it's problematic at a point. Mentioned that, early on when books about comic book history were coming out, they were mostly focused on the Golden Age. This is a book that came out in 2005, I want to say. Let me check the indicia. 2004. It's a book called Men of Tomorrow, and this is a little different from some other books in that it spends as much time talking about the industry of the Golden Age as it does about the characters and the release and the particular issues that came out. Maybe a little more so. Almost reads kind of like a spy novel, if that makes any sense. I think because of how colorful some of the characters were, like Major Nicholson, who started DC, and various other people, Jack Cole, who was the creator of Plastic Man. So it's a fun read, even though there's like murder when it gets to some of the creators from Lev Gleason's stable. Amazing stories that are in here. Why it is problematic, though, and he's currently in the pokey for possession of child pornography. So problematic, but it remains to be an excellent book. And why I have another book in my hands is this one. Cavalier and Clay is not a book about comic book history, yet it is. It's a fiction book written by Michael Chabon, a Pulitzer Prize-winning book. And I have many friends who have read this book who don't give a shit about comic books.
Really?
Because he's a very powerful author. And, they saw it, at the top of a particular New York Times bestseller list and gobbled it up. Imagine the story of Simon and Schuster, but there's a little bit of an LGBT element in that. Mm-hmm. If you have not read this book, you have to. It's a wonderful book. And this is like an amazing companion because it's like the real life, and then you have in your hand here what a very good author does with the real life concepts and spins them into this amazing fictional world of Cavalier and Clay. So there you go. This is sort of a recommendation, but someone who possessed child pornography wrote this. So
maybe like get it at a library rather than buying a copy.
In this time of Allen versus Farrow, I guess it's topical. I don't know, but there we go.
Wanted to say a couple hellos as well to some other people who joined us. David Toby has joined us
on
Facebook. So hello, David. He was basically saying, you've been reading comics since before I was born. Yes, we know, you're so young.
Yeah, we know. But
and then also Lima Nato, also joining us on YouTube.
Oh, good. Hello. It's a new name. That's good to hear.
Yeah. Haven't seen you yet, so thank you for joining us.
Absolutely.
Adventures of Cavalier and Clay. I know James just mentioned that he's probably read that as well. I know that was a pretty big title for a while. When I worked at Barnes and Noble, it was everywhere that we were shilling it. Well, we didn't have to shill it. It just flew off the shelves.
And you haven't read it yet?
No, I haven't read it.
Oh, for shame, Steve, for shame.
I had other books to read, and that's like the story of my life. I had other books to read.
Okay.
But it's funny that you should mention that, sort of like the stories of the Golden Age, and then, of course, the Silver Age, and then into the Bronze Age. And I just wanted to throw this out, just really pick it up. I know we've talked about it before. We've had this wonderful gentleman, Clifford Mathel, on our podcast before several times, but Comic Book Babylon for the copy. This one, Clifford did send over to me. So again, thank you very much, Clifford. This is an incredible book. I mean, it's referring here, the title itself is an homage to Hollywood Babylon, but this does have some really amazing stories and essays about several creators from the Silver Age and into the Bronze Age of comics. So that sort of listening, going through those eras and finding out about those creators and the work that they've done, through Cliff's eyes here and his correspondence with them, it's pretty fantastic and very fascinating. Just an interesting era and development of the comic industry. And speaking again of the comic industry,
if I can just interject there,
sure. Yeah,
I'm on a delay.
Oh, no.
Okay. I'm waiting for you to catch up. Seem to be on a delay.
I can hear you fine now.
I don't think it's me, folks. I think it's the other guy. Just waiting for that little cycle to finish here. This is good radio. Okay.
Interesting.
You there, Steve?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, there's a delay here, and it doesn't seem to be me for once.
Okay.
But anyway. Okay, I'm just going to wait for it to catch up, which it should in a second. Yeah, you're freezing a lot for me now. I don't know if we can keep going.
Okay. I'm just not going to talk for a little bit.
I'm trying to see what this looks like on the feed.
Yeah.
Am I freezing for you?
It's just it. Am I freezing for you? In a while. You're not freezing for me now.
Okay, because you're totally freezing for me.
I don't know what's causing it.
Yeah, you're frozen again now.
Are you sure it's me frozen and just not moving? Should I do jazz hands for a
No,
little while?
it's you freezing because you're like frozen in jazz hands like this.
Oh, okay. That's very strange.
We'll try to keep going.
Very strange.
Just in terms of people that have been on the show with books about comic books, I also want to give a shout out to Rob Kelly, who had the Hey Kids Comics compilation. He's been on our show, and this comes out from Crazy 8 Press, which has a lot of books from aforementioned Paul Kupperberg and some other people directly on this topic. And also, though it's way over there, we once had Peter David on with his Avengers book, the sort of coffee table book that he had, if you remember that, Steve.
I think so.
Yeah. So
yes, I do remember that.
Check out some old episodes about that, and you can go. So you're next. So tell us about something you want to talk about in terms of books about comics.
Well, hopefully I've caught up and I'm not as delayed anymore. But there are again, if you're really interested in the history of certain publishers, obviously there's some really great academic work that's out there, really great history stuff that's out there. You mentioned one of them, Marvel Comics, The Untold Story, which came out, maybe about 10 years ago now.
Oh, not that long. I don't think.
It feels like it.
Really?
It feels like it's been out for a while. By Sean Howe, 2012, so almost 10 years. Yeah.
Oh wow! I didn't think it was that old.
This is a great book, and it's again it goes at it as this is a person who is a fan. Sean Howe is a fan of comics, fan of the history of Marvel. So there are some moments in here, obviously, that don't really shy away from the less gallant nature of certain heroes of ours and certain practices within the industry. And we've talked about that a lot. And I think there's always an ongoing debate about certain people's place and responsibility for some of those not so great practices and not so great, say, stealing of the limelight. But this really goes through really the whole history of everybody who's involved in the 60s and 70s in Marvel, and even further beyond that. But it's a great book if you really want to sit down and read. There aren't a lot of pictures, so there's not a lot here other than prose. This is a really, this is a fascinating read, but it is a long read, so definitely come up with that. And then also, in the same vein, also looking at the warts, the bumps, the not so great stuff. We Told You So, Comics as Art, which is the history of Fantagraphics and Fantagraphics Press. This one has a lot more interesting, images, plates, things like that, examples of comics and the creators. Lots of photographs from the history of all the different people who have been involved in it. Definitely a very fascinating read as well, because, for an independent press, Fantagraphics has had a lot of success. They put out some amazing work over the years and some amazing collections. And of course, this book itself, also put out by Fantagraphics Press, it is just beautiful, and very, very much in line with a lot of the others that they put out. But again, it gives you a really great story and history on a comics publisher that's been around since the late 70s and early 80s until today. So I don't know, Bill, have you read a lot of great sort of just publisher based works? Like books about history?
I did want to go into a publisher just now. I have never read Marvel the Untold Story, but I've listened to Marvel the Untold Story because it's one of those books that's available in audiobook. And I want to talk about another book which concentrates on one publisher, but is a little more broader than that soon. But going back to Marvel, a recommendation that I have is Comic Wars. And this is written by Dan Raviv. And Dan Raviv mostly writes about Middle Eastern conflict. But in this case, the war that he's talking about was the war for Marvel Comics. And it does occupy a certain chapter, a certain section in the Untold Story. Yeah. But there was a point where Ronald Perlman and Carl Icahn two billionaire investors were basically jockeying for control of Marvel when Marvel was really down on its luck. And this book goes into Avi Arad and Toy Biz and the developments that led into Marvel becoming a force in film. It doesn't go up to the Disney acquisition. It's not that far. But to specifically concentrate on business aspects, don't really expect to, hear about the Hulk, and this, it's, basically about the conflicts and about people trying to outbid each other and what goes down when there's a war for control. And it's a pretty interesting book. One thing I have to say, though, and this goes across the board for some of the books we're talking about, some of these go out of print like super quick. Yeah. Like the paperback for this is about $300, so God knows what the hardback is right now. I mean, it's a very limited audience. And again, later I'll be talking about one particular publisher, Tomorrow's, and they've kept their stuff in print, and thank God, because I imagine some of that stuff would get pricey if it did go out of print. So there's that. I had mentioned an audiobook, and another book about comics that's available on audiobook is by David Hadju, and the name of it's a long title. It's The 10-Cent Plague, The Great Comic Book Scare and How It Changed America. And this book is excellent. It's about the horror scare and seduction of the innocent, which was a book by Frederick Wortham, who was a clinical psychologist who said that comic books contributed to juvenile delinquency. And this was concurrent with EC Comics publishing these like amazing but really graphic horror titles at the time. The book to me is unnecessarily scary because the same narrator also narrated the Graysmith book about the Zodiac killer. So there are points where I'm like almost white knuckling it when they were talking about like book burnings and stuff. He just has a very commanding deep voice that scares the shit out of you. So but an excellent probably an excellent read, definitely an excellent listen. I do have another companion book like that, and this is a book that came out of Abrams Comic Craft, which is one of the I would say one of the higher brow, along with Fantagraphics, that publishes material like this. And this is a book called The Horror. And unlike the 10-Cent Plague, you actually get full reprints of some of the horror stories that they talk about. Oh, excellent. Which is great because a lot of the stuff is public domain at this point. And basically covers the same terrain. Very well written book. And on top of that, I know it's not as much of a bonus in the days of streaming. This isn't that old a book. Let me just see where we're at here. 2010. But it does have a bonus DVD. And the bonus DVD is a confidential file episode. Confidential file was kind of like 2020 back in the day, about the comic book controversies with the horror comics and what eventually led to the comic books code. And just to see that contemporaneous, a half-an-hour snapshot documentary about that, fascinating. You don't have to get the book to do that. It's on YouTube because it also is public domain. But this is The Horror, and guys, and the author he's not listed as an author. It said selected, edited with commentary by Jim Trombetta. This is also another book that you can go to if you want to find out about the horror scare of the 1950s with comic books.
It's interesting that you should mention that, because that kind of mentioning that sort of confidential file jogged my memory of a movie, and I think maybe that might be a completely different episode that we could talk about. There was a documentary film that came out years ago called Comic Book Confidential, that looked at the history of comic books, from the lens of I think the early 90s. I think it was, early or mid 90s when that one came out, possibly even a little bit older than that. But I mean, that looked at a lot of the same ground. It looked at, looked at the history of the original books from the Golden Age, and the history of that, and then of course all the horror books and the crime books that sort of led to the 50s backlash, parental backlash, and the creation of the Comics Code, etc. But yeah, and it's still referred to this day. The seduction of the innocent is mostly mocking in mocking tones is referred to, but it was a very important work. I mean, the fact that it completely changed an entire industry for decades after it was published, just by social outrage, at the time, and of course it came at a very particular time in American history where all subversive type of media, especially and thoughts. Were being really severely oppressed, or guided in a way that would be socially acceptable and or politically correct.
Yeah,
for the 50s. So
it was interesting. It was interesting. Years after that controversy with Frederick Wortham, Stanley actually kind of became friends with him.
Really?
And there's one interview where Stanley says, this guy was genuinely concerned about children. He was genuinely concerned. He just put his attention in the wrong direction. And it was really interesting to hear that, because everything that you will read in these books is, really demonizes him. And, of course we don't agree with the trajectory that his advocacy, moved, but it was interesting to hear that perception of, not making someone not as a devil when that's all you've ever heard about them in the past.
Well, and I can agree with that. I think that there were certain forces, either political and or social, that existed that were looking for the excuse, that were looking for a tool to use, and Seduction of the Innocent worked really well for directly attacking an entire industry that was kind of on the list. Films had already kind of been brought to heel with with the Hays Code and then the MPAA afterwards. But I think there's a lot of other sort of need, because there's so much that was happening. You've got television that's ruining and rotting people's minds, and comic books are this is easy. We can get rid of this because they're a relatively weak industry. They can't really fight back as much. And you can still see, I think on YouTube, you can still see Gaines's up in front of Congress when they were having a panel about comic books and the influence on children and sort of their the message and whatnot. And he did try to defend what EC Comics was publishing at the time, and and the value of it. But unfortunately, other voices prevailed there. So, you had mentioned Two Morrows Publishing as being a pretty prolific publisher of comic writing. I don't read too much from them, but I know that every time we're at a convention together, we do kind of stop by the booth and peruse their wares. What do they put out?
Well, they've put out a lot of the books that come under the companion banner are reprints of articles that appeared in their particular magazines, like Alter Ego or Back Issue or Comic Book Artist or Draw, and they're compiled. Some take a little bit of a different turn, and I'm going to pull out, thank you for the segue. So I'm going to pull out two that I really enjoyed recently. This book is me. It's Comic Book Fever, a celebration of comics 1976 to 1986. So that's
a perfect time. That's the timing.
Just think of like little Timmy Zanowitz. And it covers the period which is commonly known as the Bronze Age period. Bronze starts a little bit earlier in the early 70s, arguably with Green Lantern, Green Arrow, and when Kirby went to DC. But this is what was happening when I was reading. Again, I left comics for a while, but was back for 85 and 86. The character here is Snyder Man, And this is a tribute to Erwin Snyder, who was the owner of Heroes World Distribution. And if you've ever seen these amazing superhero catalogs from the 70s and early 80s, it was from his store, and got other stories about that. But it covers all the craziness that went on in the 70s, because in the 70s, comics were basically a dying industry. It was, the profit margin was very low. One book in particular did save it, and that was Marvel's Star Wars. And that had a spillover effect to other books and even other publishers, that brought people, either back or into comic books in 1977. But I didn't know that at the time. I just knew I was getting these great comic books. But it was a period of just throwing stuff against the wall and seeing what was sticking. So you had stuff like the Sword and Sorcery stuff, which wasn't anything I ever really. The post-apocalyptic stuff, which I hated. But yeah, Planet of the Apes, Commandy, Killraven, that's not me. No. Sorry, folks. And but you did have advances like, Black Lightning, the first time an African-American character was headlining a book by himself. Of course, we had the Falcon before, with the combo title of Captain America and the Falcon, but just crazy stuff that went on. You had comic books about Mother Teresa and Pope John Paul. You had the infiltration of the toys with G.I. Joe #1, which was a big boost to the industry as well. And it's fun. I mean, this is a fun book. The book I hardly recommend, but I'm not sure how much interest it would have for people that don't have a foot in the water there, is Comic Book Implosion, an oral history of DC Comics circa 1978. In 1978, DC had a publishing initiative called the DC Explosion. All the books expanded by 8 pages, and most of those titles would have an 8-page backup. I would have been 10 years old when this hit.
Mm-hmm.
I can't tell you how excited I was for the DC Explosion. 3 months later, it was all gone. What had happened was there was a major blizzard season, the winter of 77 into 78. And with the way that sales were logged, it was a much bigger delay. So when Warner Brothers saw DC was basically, had like negligible profits, or were like completely in the red on some titles, they canceled most of the line. DC was down to 20 monthly titles and 6 bi-monthly titles, which,
it's a big
half of 52, I guess. That's a carry number. One of the authors, Keith Dallas, is a friend, and it's written with John Wells, and I don't know why I haven't had Keith on here. We really got to talk about this at some point. But for a very particular period of DC Comics history, which was, it was sad. I mean, it was sad going to the newsstand and seeing so few titles. But company persevered, and the backstories to some of these. There's one book that's in there that was in development called The Black Bomber. You have to read it. There's no way this could have been it was politically incorrect for 1975. So some of the backstories are amazing in this issue. So much hope was ascribed to the Superman movie in December 78, turning things around, which it kind of did, but I don't think to the degree that the industry thought it would. And so again, the 2 titles that I had before here were both published by Tomorrow's Publications, and they are they're kicking it still. They survived the pandemic. It sounds like it was very problematic for them to keep their doors open, but they did. All their magazines that were eventually published, though there were some delays that were planned, and they have books about just an amazing array of titles, and also somewhat goes up to the present day, which is a little strange for books about comic book history, but things move fast nowadays, and that doesn't surprise me as well. I, for one, would love to see like a really good book about the 2000s in comic books.
Yeah.
I would absolutely love to see that, with, DC in the early part, firing on all cylinders, which I think culminated with 52, Marvel with the Ultimate Universe, and, what Bendis was doing, revived the Avengers, which is really dead at that point.
Yeah.
So I really would like to see a book about that, some of the independent publishers, the inroads to film, particularly with Marvel between 2000 and 2010. That's one book I'd really like to see.
Well, and just to go back to the viewer comments here. This is going way back here. Lee Manedo on YouTube talking about Cavalier and Clay left an indelible imprint on my mind as a Golden Age comics admirer and a gay reader that up until the time I read it didn't think that there would be such an amazing connection. And so, that's definitely great. Thanks for that comment, Lima. And then also James does have here as well something to Tomorrow's is awesome. Their Modern Masters line is so good. And they have a comic book creator special on Barry Windsor Smith coming out later this month to coincide with this comeback to comics. And so that's good. That's a good point right there. I know every time that there we go.
This is a Modern Masters on Kevin McGuire. Yep.
Nice. I know every time that Bill and I are at a convention together, we always do go past the Tomorrow's booth, and I am missing that because they do always have a huge selection of stuff. Their alter ego back issues are all almost always all available. They have several books that they're publishing and promoting that time. So, it's definitely a good time.
Great on Sundays, folks. Great on
Sundays. Hint, hint, hint. But yeah, you can get their. I think you can get their books normally throughout the year. You can either buy them off their website or order them through some distributors.
And also, if you're a digital person, they have almost their entire catalog on digital too. So,
yeah, and that's a good point. I think you mentioned about Audible, getting an Audible or an audiobook version. I think, with the exception of the fact that a lot of these books do have just as many pictures as they do words. Some of the more wordy prose and based histories, I'm sure that you can find them on Audible or digitally as well, just in case you can't find a hard copy of it.
A great Audible recommendation: the audiobook for Super Gods by Grant Morrison.
Oh yeah, does he read it though?
Really well done. No, I wish it was. I wish you had that. I wish I had a better Grant Morrison imitation. I tried. Batman and Robin's a terrible film, but the colors are great.
Yeah.
But it always turns into Willie from The Simpsons.
Yeah. Well, he is Willie from The Simpsons, just without any hair. There's a great Scottish, and I believe it's on my Plex bill. There's a great Scottish special about the history of Scotland and comics, because Scotland, of course, gave us some great creators, Mark Millar and James and Morrison, but they also are the birthplace of the original Dennis the Menace, I believe, up in Dundee, Scotland, and really where 2008.
It's a different Dennis the Menace from
different Dennis the Menace, one with the black and red striped shirt.
I didn't know that was on your Plex. Do you know the name of that?
I'll have to look it up, but I'll let you know. I've got a couple of those kind of specials in there. And it's an older one from, I think, the late 90s. So Mark Millar is still kind of talking about, I've got these plans now that my big movie got picked up. And I think he was talking about, yeah, it was Wanted. Yeah.
Wanted.
Talking about Wanted, and I've got another thing coming up.
Colors are great. The colors are
great. Yes, Willie, they're all great. So one of the things that I did want to mention, because I enjoy it too, I like compilations. And I think Tomorrow's does this as well, but there are some other publishers out there that look at, rather than just going through the history kind of in a dry way, or, a very fact kind of way, They like to look at the funnier, goofier aspects of comics. And comics in its almost 100-year history, the comics that we consider comics, have some fun stuff and some weird things and some misses. Not so much in the way it hits, but a lot of misses. And one series that I love, put out by Quirk Books and written by John Morris, is the Regrettable series. And he has three. He has Regrettable Superheroes, Regrettable Sidekicks, and the one that I don't own, which is Regrettable Supervillains. And his write-up is fun. It's hilarious. He lets these characters speak for themselves a lot of times. But it almost plays like, and I love this as a kid too. Remember the old DC Who's Who, or the Marvel, like the Marvel profiles? I loved all those things. I had a binder.
You talk about the Hot Moose?
Oh yeah.
Hot Moose. Yeah.
But you get when you go through this book, you always get some great illustrations of these individual characters and a full write-up with the history of who wrote them, who created them, where they first appeared, like how long they lasted for, what kind of books they were in, and just really goes through a lot of that. You have some weird ones here. Regrettable Superhero Brain Boy, which I don't know if you remember, but
Dark Horse.
I want to say it was Dark Horse revived that recently, and I actually really enjoyed it. You've got Brother Power the Geek from DC. You've got a bunch of other characters here that are really great. They're just fun to read. And then, of course, with Regrettable Sidekicks, what's a superhero without a sidekick? You have some really fun ones that don't really make a lot of sense, like Papa, who was Junior Genius's sidekick, and it was his father, who unfortunately was a complete and utter dunce. That would follow Junior Genius around and kind of help him out and be really goofy and stupid. But it was just a fun foil. A lot of them are just really fun and wacky. And here's one that we all know if we've been watching the Stargirl series, Stripesy, who was the sidekick to the Star-Spangled Kid. And, of course, now as Stripe, S-T-R-I-P-E, is the sidekick to Stargirl, Psychic, and Mentor. But these books are just a great read. They're a lot of fun. You can pick them up, flip to any page, and get a laugh, and then also learn something pretty wacky about comics history. What kind of things got thrown out there that people were actually publishing and writing about? As far back as the 30s and the 40s, and also a little bit. There's usually some newer ones in here too, probably as far as the 80s, but not so much further forward than that. But it's a lot of fun, and I really recommend them. Quirk Books put them out. You can pretty much find them anywhere now. But there's all three so far.
Is it Quirk or Yo?
Quirk. So Quirk, Quirk, Quirk Books.
And who's the author credit on that?
The author is John Morris. So kind of like he's sort of like an editing author as well, but he does have a full essay write-up on every single one of these characters, talking about the history and the impact and or lack of impact, let's just say.
And also in terms of the regrettable, what was the first volume, the red one, the Regrettable Heroes?
Regrettable Superheroes, yeah.
There was a condensed version of that appeared in a Loot Crate a couple of years ago. So there were literally like hundreds of thousands of copies of that out there, which you probably can get for really cheap on eBay if you want a sample. But and again, Steve, I also have the first volume of that, and those are fun books. The next book I wanted to talk about, and it's weird because we were like jumping around with the histories, and one area where I haven't come across many great books about it, the time period, is the Silver Age. And this is a book that I would highly recommend. I talked earlier about Grant Morrison's Super Gods, and his discussion of the Silver Age concepts in that book. They're great, but they're very Grant Morrison. So take that however you take that. But this is probably the best one I've found. And it's not from a named publisher. It's what's the name of the publisher here? I just went past it. Oh, God damn it. Bear Manor Media. There's a little panda bear on the bottom Bear Manor Media. And the author is William Shull, and this is really good in terms of encapsulating the story of the Silver Age, mostly dedicated to the books themselves, not the industry aspect.
Mm-hmm.
Though there's a touch of that, but nothing like Men of Tomorrow that I talked about earlier. And you can still find this fairly cheap, and not a lot of notoriety for this one, but I thought this was a really effective book, especially for people who don't have a familiarity with the Silver Age, because it does write about things in a modern context for comparisons and references. So Silver Age of Comics by William Shull is another recommendation from me.
We actually we've got a comment about again from Lima about Super Gods. That's Morrison work Super Gods is also a religious experience for me. Yeah, for a lot of people too, probably. A few years after reading Slaughterhouse 5, developed some mixed feelings toward Morrison's ideas. True, but Super Gods still is very fun read, very inspired. Very true. There's. And I think it is really interesting when you do have a lot of readers, a lot of comic book readers, especially now. Comic book readers now, I think, incorporate a really diverse group, and a lot more adults, a lot more people with experience who have maybe a bigger academic background or a bigger history of reading a diverse set of literature. And comics are really geared, I think, towards I don't want to say to all audiences. Obviously, there is still general comics for everybody. But I think with these authors now, and for the past 20, 30 years, have really been focusing a lot of their attention on this is art. This is definitely something that they want to put their thoughts, their philosophies, and everything out there. Obviously, we talked about Ditko a couple weeks back, of doing that through his work, through his lifetime. But maybe I think in general, there's a lot more of that now. I think a lot more authors have a lot to say.
Yeah. And also, again, we're referencing Ditko, and Zach Crucy was on our episode with his book, Mysterious Travelers. And University of Minnesota, what was this publisher? I want to say
yes, I think so.
Or St. Louis or something. That publisher.
Yes.
They have a lot of great books. Also, Sequart, the company Sequart, they have very, very academic books about comic book history. A great one, which is over there, which I'm not going to go grab, which is related to comic books, but not specifically, is a great book called Gotham City 14 Miles, which talks about the importance of the Batman 66 series on comics creators. So you have people like Greg Rucka contributing, and Mark Waid, and talking about what inspiration they took from that, because that was it in terms of a visual representation in live action for a lot of those creators initially. I've been talking about comics in general, but there are some really great books that talk about a particular franchise. I did want to reference the there's a laptop. The Thunder Agents Companion. If you know my history, I used to have a Thunder Agents podcast with my friend Rob Stager, and all those episodes are available on the Comic Book Bears feed if you want to check them out. And this was an invaluable assist when we were doing that podcast, going through the history of that very specialized franchise. You also get, and I think you can appreciate this being a former Barnes & Noble employee, the concept of the coffee table book, which you see more and more with comic books right now. This, to me, is probably the best of them, which is Justice League 100 Greatest Moments. It's written by Bob Greenberger, who was a longtime editor of DC Comics. And I would say especially, just the pages, it's beautiful paper that they use here. It goes through what he believes are the greatest moments in the history of that franchise. And for somebody who hasn't read a lot of Justice League, I imagine this is a great primer. I would love to give this to somebody who maybe is watching the Snyder Cut as we speak, and might want to get into the comic books, I would definitely recommend this for somebody first getting into that particular franchise, because it's it makes its arguments, but it does so in a fun way throughout. I absolutely love this book, and this was like kind of like, oh, Rob got me a comic book gift. Oh my God, because I don't get a lot in terms of gifts along those lines. So I was happy for it, but I was really surprised at how well conceived this book was. And I have one more recommendation if we can get it in.
Sure.
And it's not a type of comic book that I read a lot about, but I enjoy reading about them more than reading them. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does perfectly, actually.
War Stories, a graphic history. This is actually, this version is from Collins Design, which is a HarperCollins subsidiary, but it's actually a British book, and goes through the history of war and the comics that were represented, goes up to the Iraq War, and really detailed and thoroughly researched, and particularly in the chapters about the Nam and Pride of Baghdad, really, really well written essays in this. The author is Mike Conroy, and particularly with the history of British comic books, which is basically much more popular at points than superheroes were during the history of the British industry. Just some amazing stuff I didn't know about at all. Like I just fell out of the tree with books like Commando and some of these amazing things. Really good write-up about Warren Comics with their short-lived Blazing Combat, which I think if more people read the Vietnam War, probably wouldn't have lasted as long. But if you can find this, it's definitely worth a read, even if you're not into war stories, because it is such a well-conceived book. So that was my last recommendation. Of course, there's others. Over there is the book by Paul Levitz that I got about the history of DC Comics. The suggested retail price was $250. I got it at a Tash and sale for $50 a couple years ago, because I'm me. And you can find, and that is the definitive history of DC Comics, and you can find that book chopped up a bit into the Silver Age and the Golden Age and Batman, Robin, Superman. If you ever see the smaller Taschen books that predominantly are at Barnes & Noble, that's what those are generated from that. Some of the Vault books, the DC Vault, the Marvel Vault, the Spider-Man Vault, Batman Vault, those books are excellent. Not just detailing the history of the character, but seeing the weird ephemera, and there's some really good stuff out there. There's also a lot of books I haven't got yet that I really, especially doing prep for this, I think it kind of lit the fire. There's a book called Slugfest, which is about the history of the DC Marvel rivalry, and also the very recent I can't say biography about Stan Lee. So there's a lot of stuff out there, and a lot that we recommend from this.
And a lot of it, just to kind of mention, a lot of it is not without controversy, because have, especially when you have fans writing about this, and most people who are writing about comics are fans. I don't think there are any I hate comic books, I'm going to devote years of my life to research about how much I hate them, other than Frederick Wortham, but that was 70 years ago. There are people who really do love comics, and sometimes will write about maybe more controversial things, maybe not as controversial things, and then get called out on it. So it's there's a lot of really interesting dialogue that happens for people who write about comics outside of websites, which I think and I think a lot of people, a lot of viewers, a lot of listeners are probably familiar with. There's tons of comics journalism out there, and I'm making some quotations for some journalism that happens. But there are sometimes you can find some really great articles online. Slate, Vox do have a lot of comics journalism that happens. On some of the other sites, sometimes Bleeding Cool, sometimes Newsarama now, and other sort of devoted sites like Comics Beat, Geeks of Doom. They do have a lot of comics journalism that happens there. People writing not just reviews about something, but just kind of talking about sort of a history of a particular topic, or something like that. But one thing I did want to, my last recommendation. This is one that's a good grounding for, I think, a lot of people who are looking for something to read about comics in general. Maybe something to give to someone who's just looking to kind of understand comics more, and do I really need to read this, or what's the point of reading comics? And that, of course, is this classic by Scott McCloud, Understanding Comics. I know Caleb has talked about this before. I think he's even shown, I think it was this version.
Actually, all three of us showed our copies, and you didn't have one in hand.
Yeah, I did have mine with me, so that's just sad. So now I've got my comic with my Understanding Comics with me, and he's written several several books since then. This as well, kind of talking about different aspects of comics literary. But this is like the very basic, everything that you need to know about comics as an art form, comics as a medium, just sort of explaining that bit by bit. But in doing so, he also talks about certain movements within comics, certain forms of comic books, certain traditions of comic books, like comparing Western, American, and European styles, which again are very different, even though they have a very similar sort of background, to Japanese comics, which, manga has an extremely different history and inspiring point, and a different aesthetic altogether. So something that we might actually have an episode coming up on some manga again. But definitely if you're looking for basic information, or you're trying to introduce somebody to sort of the idea that there's a lot more to comics than really cool stories and really amazing art and just really cool diverse topics, which comics are wonderful. You can give them Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud. Timeless.
If I could just, I also would like to reinforce your recommendation about comic book websites. And one thing that is nice about comic book websites is you can pretty much tell the difference between those that take the journalism seriously and the clickbait garbage fairly quickly off the bat. Can't always do that with film sites. Film sites are a little weird, but you do have the benefit of that luxury with the particular comic book websites, which is nice to see. Also, I do also want to address what you said about controversial issues, and for some reason, and I think you've read this in comics histories, and I've read it certainly, there is a Rashomon aspect to a lot of it too. That people don't seem to have alignment in terms of their recollections of events, which can be fun, but I can imagine also for a writer can be very frustrating if you're putting this material together, and how much credence to give one person over the other. Even Wolfman and Perez, who are a really unified team, they don't agree with how things went down with the creation of the new Teen Titans. So even a team that has worked as closely as those two individuals, that there is some noise in regards to recollection. So keep that in mind when you do read histories of comic books, because that happens a lot.
So no, that's great. That's great. Yeah, great point.
Yeah.
One thing, we have two quick suggestions here, or two quick comments. Another one from Lima, University of Mississippi, which is what you're trying to remember.
Yes.
Has a lot of academic books about comics. And then also, James did want to mention Scott McCloud incorporated a lot of manga into his Zot series, which is kind of where he got started, was with Zot, and then basically transitioned right into comics academia. And is an amazing voice for comics as an art and of course a study, as much as it is fun. Okay,
so you have your reading list, folks.
Just a few books.
I'm seriously thinking right after we're done, I'm going to get Slugfest. I don't know why I dragged my feet on that. It's been out for like 3 years. Yeah.
Yeah,
All right.
yeah.
Well, judging by the time, it looks like we have to start wrapping this up. And when we wrap an episode of the Comic Book Bears up, we do so with the segment we call the Woofs of the Week segment. In the bear community, if you find a fellow attractive, you woof at him. And we do something similar here, where we spotlight something which might be a comic book, but it also may be a film or a TV program or a charitable initiative, anything under the sun that we think you, fair listener, may be interested in sampling. I'll start, as I always do, with Steve. You're the only one to go to right now. So, Steve, what is your woof of the week?
So my woof of the week, again, is television based, because that's what I do. I watch a crap ton of TV if I'm not reading comics. Probably watch more TV than I should be, so because I've got this many comics to read. But one series that actually has a great connection with its cast to the things that we love, comics, comic movies, and Star Wars, is the little series that could, Kim's Convenience, which is a Canadian sitcom about a Korean Canadian family that operates a convenience store in Toronto. And it's very simple sitcom premise. Paul Hyun-sung Lee, who plays Mr. Kim himself, and the cast that plays his family. His oldest son, is played by Simu Liu, who is going to be the new Shang-Chi for Marvel. That movie is coming out later this year, hopefully. This is a show that he's been on for the entire run. And then also Paul Hyun-sung Lee himself was just in this past season of The Mandalorian. He played one of the X-Wing Patrol pilots, and is a huge comics fan, is a huge Star Wars fan, big nerd guy. Also, I think qualifies, even though he may be straight, but he kind of qualifies as a bear there. It's such a great show, really funny. The characters are all really familiar, I think, for a lot of people. It's just some great, family emotional beats as well as comic beats. And sadly, this is season 5 that's airing right now. Seasons 1 through 4 are all available on Netflix, and season 5 will probably be available in the next several months. But season 5, unfortunately, will be the last season. CBC is not continuing with the TV series, so they won't be able to really wrap it up, I think, the way that they wanted to, unfortunately. And Simu Liu actually wrote a really great post a couple weeks ago when they announced the cancellation of the series, to talk about how disappointed he was and how he was looking forward to expanding this so much. Obviously, he's got a pretty big history right now in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I think that kind of goes without saying that he's definitely going to be a major player going forward there. But this was a great way to see him sort of as a family sitcom character. And they're just a lot of fun. So if you're up in Canada, it's on CBC on, I believe, Tuesday nights. And if you're not in Canada, outside, you can watch it on Netflix. Seasons 1 through 4 are there, and season 5 will be added once it's done airing in Canada. So that's my recommendation, Kim's Convenience.
Okay. My wolf of the week goes out to 2 comic book publishers and some other people. If you were following the news this week, we had the announcements that both DC and Marvel were doing initiatives for Pride Month in June. DC will have an anthology series, a series of covers that are variant covers that reflect the LGBT community, and there's a couple of other series and issues that are sprinkled within the mix there. And Marvel has a dedicated issue of their Marvel Voices series to LGBT creators, and also the Star Wars comics will have variant covers with characters that do have some ambit to LGBTQ issues, such as Lando Calrissian and Dr. Aphra. That was just announced today. I don't know if you saw that. But the bigger wolf out of that, I want to give out to our straight allies. Because on the comic book boards, again, in the world where we have QAnon and all this incel nonsense, of course, there were people bashing the announcements about Pride. It was particularly weird seeing it on a Legion page, because some anti-trans attitudes about the Dreamer story, which is kind of surprising because there's been a major trans character in Legion, Aaron Siobhan, for ages, going back to like forever. Which really surprised me. And it wasn't so much the gay voices on those boards and on those pages, but it was the straight voices, the allies that were putting these people in their places and, telling them it's 2021, wake up. And it was really heartening to see because they did our job for us. In a sense. It still baffles me, some of the attitudes that are still out there, but especially with X-Men fans, I'll never understand a bigoted X-Men fan. I don't understand how the DNA allows that, but it's the world we live in. So again,
I love that. The DNA. How does the DNA and X-Men mutant fans? So DC and Marvel for their Pride books, and our straight allies for coming to, I don't want to say our defense, but overloading the forums with sensible posts. I'm just lacking the vocabulary at almost 11 p.m. to really express what I want to here, but you get it. So yeah.
All right, this one's finito, or as we should say like books, the end. And again, we are the Comic Book Bears podcast. You can find us on the Twitter and the Tumblr and the Instagram as Comic Book Bears. You can find us on the Facebook as Comic Book Bears Podcast. If you want to listen to us, please download us through iTunes. Listen to us through Stitcher Radio and some of the other podcasting platforms. If you want to write to us, please do so by sending an email to comicbookbears@gmail.com. And if you would, please like our YouTube page. We are still trying to increase our profile on this particular platform, and any support would be greatly appreciated. Until next time, I'm Bill Zanowitz.
And I'm Steve Mowry.
You're going to hear a woof and an explosion, and we'll be back real soon. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Woof.